Good evening, Mr. Justice Bukhari. My name is Anisa, and I'm today's MC. Welcome to our lecture, Leaders to Leaders Lecture Series 2014, which is jointly organized by the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups and the University of Hong Kong and fully supported by the Hang Seng Bank. This year is our 10th year, and we have a total of 362 student leaders from over 100 schools in Hong Kong. We're very honored to have invited Mr. Justice Bukhari to be our guest speaker today, to share his experiences and opinions, as well as introducing the tangible concept of rule of law to us today, particularly on the topic of human rights. As one of the most respected men in the world of law, Mr. Justice Bukhari was one of the 3 permanent judges of Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal from its inception in 1997, and as he retired from the past as a permanent judge, he has been a non-permanent judge of the Court of Final Appeal since 2012. He is considered as the most liberal among all judges of the Court of Appeal and became known as the conscience of the court. May we now invite Mr. Justice Bukhari to the stage with a round of applause.
I will stand here to speak to you because that will guarantee that I won't speak too long. I am very pleased to see so many young people here. With your permission, I will dedicate my remarks to 2 people, younger even than the youngest person here. They are my 2 grandchildren, Zane, who if you ask him will tell you he is aged 2, and my other grandson, Jack, who is aged 1. Democracy in Hong Kong is evolving and still far from fully evolved. Most people in Hong Kong seem to agree that democratic development is needed. But there is acute controversy over the form and the pace of such development. This controversy is not only political, it has become a matter of party politics. And as a judge, which I still am, I must steer clear of politics, especially party politics. The question which I can and will raise is this: can the rule of law prevail in the absence of full democracy? I will give my answer and then explain the concepts involved in that answer. My answer is yes, on certain conditions. First, there has to be independent judicial enforcement of an entrenched constitution. Second, powers must be properly separated. Third, human rights must be protected in conformity with international standards. Fourth, finally, and most importantly, the existence of the rule of law, even before the implementation of full democracy, must not be treated as justification for delay in democratic development. I told you that I would explain the concepts involved in my answer. The first of the conditions which I named involve two concepts which I should explain. One is judicial independence, and the other is an entrenched constitution. The second condition involves only one concept to be explained. It is the separation of powers. The third condition also involves only one concept to be explained. It is the concept of human rights. The fourth and final condition, you'll remember it is that the existence of democracy, even in advance of full democracy, must not be treated as justification for delay in democratic development, is a condition which I regard as essentially self-explanatory. Other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. That is how it was put by Mr. Justice Black when delivering the judgment of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Westbury and Sanders, decided in 1963. Even though we can uphold the rule of law in the absence of full democracy, we can do that only for a limited period. Now, turning to the rule of law, I will not attempt to come up with a complete definition of the rule of law. But the four conditions which I have stated should already have sketched a picture of the rule of law in outline, at least broad outline. And I trust that my explanations of the relevant concepts will provide you with a sound understanding of the rule of law in meaningful action, not just in theory, but in meaningful action. Judicial independence consists essentially of appointing judges of integrity and ability, leaving them to decide purely according to their true view of the law and the facts, and giving effect to their decisions. There are many detailed measures by which to preserve this independence, and there are many ways in which it is liable to be undermined and eroded. The ultimate safeguard is constant vigilance on the part of who? On the part of the public. Constitutional law consists of the laws that establish the principal branches of government and set out the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. Now, typically, the principal branches of government are the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The executive and the legislature are the political branches of government. They should be formed, and they should then perform democratically. The judiciary is the politically neutral branch of government. Impartiality, fidelity to the rule of law, and independence are its defining characteristics. A constitution may, as in Britain, for example, be made up of the ordinary laws, or it may, as in the United States, for example, be contained in a single document which cannot be changed by the ordinary legislative process. Such immunity from change is known as entrenchment. And that tells you what I mean when I spoke of an entrenched constitution safeguarded by an independent judiciary. Specifically, an entrenched constitution is safeguarded by the judicial power of constitutional review. Now, by virtue of this power, any legislation, any rule of common law, any executive measure that is inconsistent with the Constitution will be struck down by the courts. In other words, declared by the courts to be invalid, null and void and of no effect. The power of constitutional review will be exercised by the judiciary in such a way that leaves to the political branches of government everything that can be properly left to them. One of the consequences of this is that insofar as the political branches of government are formed by the democratic process, all due respect will be accorded to democracy. As to how constitutional review is exercised by the courts, let me give you 3 points to be noted. Of these, the first is that striking down is a course of last resort. So if an ordinary reading of, say, any piece of legislation would result in incompatibility with the Constitution, the courts will not immediately strike it down. The courts will try their best to give the legislation what we call a remedial interpretation. That means a reading which is compatible with the Constitution. If the language and context make such a reading possible, even though it departs from the most literal meaning of the words used, then that is the reading which the courts will give the legislation, and it will avoid a striking down. If it is impossible to read the legislation compatibly with the Constitution, then striking down will be unavoidable. And this brings me to the second point, which is this. The striking down will be tailored so as to strike down as little as possible. And by that I mean as little as possible qualitatively. The courts will preserve as much as possible of the true substance of the legislative scheme intended by the executive, which introduced the legislation, and the legislature when enacted that. And if the executive and the legislature are formed democratically, then that will be something done in the name of democracy. Democracy is a word you're going to hear me use more than once this evening. Now I come to the third point. Sometimes when you strike something down, you're striking something down which is totally objectionable. But sometimes what you strike down may be an objectionable way of doing something which is well worth doing if you do it constitutionally. And if the legislation which we strike down is no worse than an unconstitutional way of trying to achieve something worthwhile achieving, if done in a constitutional way, and if the striking down would otherwise leave a harmful void, the question of suspension arises. And if there are circumstances of great necessity, the courts can and will suspend the striking down order for a limited period in order to provide an opportunity to introduce and enact corrective legislation. By corrective legislation, I mean legislation achieving the desired objective in a constitutional way. Now, let me give you 3 cases in which this sort of thing happened. First of all, a remedial interpretation. That's the first point. Well, we had a case where the question before us was whether a person who has undergone gender reassignment surgery can marry in the reassigned capacity. On the wording of the legislation, taken literally, I think the answer would be no. But rather than striking down the legislation, then leaving the whole of the legislation to be reenacted, we gave the legislation a remedial interpretation. And therefore, not going on the most literal meaning of the words of the statute, we held that the statute ought to be construed to permit a person who has undergone sexual reassignment surgery, which is regarded by the World Health Organization as an appropriate treatment for the condition of transgenderism, allow such a person to marry in the reassigned capacity. Now, when it comes to tailoring the striking down, the second point, we had an insider dealing tribunal case. Insider dealing could be dealt with in 2 ways. One, it could be dealt with before the insider tribunal as a civil matter, or if you took it to a very serious case, you could prosecute it as a crime in the criminal courts. The proceedings as a civil proceeding before the insider dealing tribunal was a useful alternative in many cases. But unfortunately, the scheme for that included a power to fine. And we said, look, if the insider dealing tribunal can fine somebody, that makes its proceedings criminal. And if it makes its proceedings criminal, then you can't resort to, as you would in civil cases, and as the tribunal in that case resorted to, first of all, some evidence which was obtained compulsorily. In other words, the person had to answer the questions. And you could do it on the civil balance. In a criminal case, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. In a civil case, you have to prove it's more likely than not. On the preponderance of probabilities, it's a very different thing. And we struck down the power to fine. That left the proceedings of the tribunal civil, and therefore the tribunal could proceed on a balance of probabilities. It could proceed on compelled evidence, and that made it a viable alternative to criminal proceedings, because the important powers are those of disqualification, saying that somebody who dealt inside cannot be a director of a company for a particular period of time, disgorgement, they have to come up and pay what they gained or the loss that they avoided, they have to pay costs, and so on and so forth. Now, I bring myself now back to the third point, suspension. We first laid down and we exercised the power of suspension in the case of Koo and the chief executive. What had happened was that covert surveillance in the form of interception of communications was being carried out under not legislation but an executive order. And that executive order did not lay down sufficient safeguards for the right to privacy in communications and for the freedom of communications. So we struck that down, but we suspended the striking down order for a limited period to give the government an opportunity to introduce legislation providing for this sort of thing with proper safeguards. Because you can imagine that if you strike it down and leave a void, that could be a very harmful void. I mean, this kind of covert surveillance is a legitimate means of combating crime and protecting national security in a proper way. If you remove it and leave nothing in its place, that could be a problem. Therefore, we left it in place for the time being because there was such great necessity for it, but on the condition that it would be only suspended for a limited period, 6 months from the date of the first case, for the government to introduce corrective legislation. So that is how it actually operates. And I don't want to just tell you about the theory of these things. I want to tell you about the reality of it. Because I'm not in the least bit interested in persuading you to admire the way we do things. I'm only interested in telling you how we do it so you can make up your own mind what you think about it. Now let's turn to the separation of powers. The separation of powers is a doctrine whereby the powers of the principal branches of government are kept sufficiently separate for the power of each branch to check the power of the other branches, and for a proper balance of official powers to be maintained. This is actually directed to achieving efficiency, to avoiding tyranny, and providing the sort of governance which is appropriate to a free society. Now I turn to the concept of human rights. The fundamental rights and freedoms, collectively called human rights, are for the state to protect rather than to create. Why? Because they predate the state, being inherent in the human person and being therefore the birthright of humankind. It's not for the government to give you your human rights. You were born with them. It is for the government to protect it. That is what I say as to the source of human rights. But what about the content of human rights? Well, my view of the content of human rights flows naturally from my view of their source, and what I say is this, that I have, after a lifetime in the law, not a very long lifetime because law is long and life is short, but still, in my lifetime in the law, I have come to see human rights in this way, so that people may live and let live as human beings. There are certain minimum entitlements that they can demand for themselves and must accord to others. Now, these entitlements involve civil liberties, personal security, security of property, however modest, self-expression, public participation, respect for otherness, and at least a tolerable standard of living. In short, they enable us, each and every one of us, to be ourselves and to live and let live with human dignity in how we treat others and how we are treated by them. That is the heart and soul of human rights. And it's nothing that you don't know about. Some human rights are of a civil and political nature. Others are of an economic, social, and cultural nature. There is, I think, a growing awareness maybe not growing as fast as I would like, but growing nevertheless, of the vital importance of a judicially active, indeed a judicially proactive approach to the enforcement of socio-economic rights. Now, if the law stays away from socio-economic rights, then I am sure that the best and brightest of our young people will stay away from the law. And if that happens, where will the law be? When young people, and older people too, I hope, think about the law, they are concerned to know whether law and justice are the same, or at least close together, or are they sadly far apart? Those of us who are lawyers, don't laugh because some of you will be lawyers, tend to think in terms of justice according to law. But that is not always achievable in any degree approaching completeness. There was a time when the concept of natural law was very much in people's minds and in their hearts. St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century, went so far as to say that insofar as human laws deviate from reason, they have not the nature of law, but of violence. In the 16th century, another saint, who happened to be a lawyer, counseled a form of philosophy which, as he put it, knows the dramatic context, tries to fit in with it, and plays a part in the current performance. That was the advice of St. Thomas More. And it's his practical advice, but of course, when the ultimate test of conscience confronted him, he chose martyrdom. So this kind of practicality is not unprincipled practicality. It is possible to achieve things which are principled and practical at the same time. And I hope that you will always live in a world where this is possible. When you are in your positions of authority, I won't be around. But from wherever I am, I think I'll see what you're doing, and I think I'll be pleased with what I see. More recently, Lord Radcliffe, a judge of the 20th century, said that we must never lose touch with the idea of natural law or give up the belief that all positive law bears some relation to it. I'm sure that at this stage of your lives, this early stage of your life, you are full of idealism. This is not something which you should shed. This is something to which you should hang on to, because as you enter positions of authority, this idealism will not be less important. It will be more important. Now, human rights, I have said, are inherent in the human person. The essential quality of human rights is the same as the essential quality of the rule of law and democracy taken together. Ultimately, it all goes to building and maintaining a society in which what prevails is made up of order, not anarchy; freedom, not tyranny; representation, not despotism; participation, not exclusion; right, not might; peaceable means, not violence, equality, not discrimination, compassion, not callousness, and dignity, not degradation. That is the world you're going to build. It doesn't exist yet. That's why you have to build it. Now, how does Hong Kong stand in regard to the concepts which we've been considering together, you and I? Subject to one thing, there is complete judicial independence in Hong Kong. That one thing is the power of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress to interpret or reinterpret the basic law. That power exists, but I think that there is a way for judicial independence to coexist with it, to exist alongside it. Our courts must always demonstrate to the public with crystal clarity that when deciding cases or deciding whether or not to refer cases to the Standing Committee, they will not be deflected from the true path into a path merely calculated to avoid a reinterpretation. In that way, our judiciary will be demonstrably independent, and its independence ought to be respected both within and beyond the special administrative region. As to the matter of an entrenched constitution, our constitutional basic law is entrenched. And constitutional review is, as I've indicated, exercised in Hong Kong. Turning to the separation of powers, there is in Hong Kong a proper separation of the judiciary from the political branches of government. And as between the two political branches of government, the problem is not of insufficient separation, perhaps. There is room for there to be a closer alignment. As for human rights in Hong Kong, I would say that our Constitution, our laws under the Constitution, and our institutions provide the means by which to protect human rights in conformity with international standards. Now, those means existing, it is for us, not just the courts, but for all of us, the courts, the legal profession, the legal academy, the media, and the general public, all of us, to make good use of those means. Up to now, Hong Kong has managed to uphold the rule of law, even though we have not yet achieved full democracy. We have not done it perfectly, but by and large, I think we have managed to uphold the rule of law, even though we have not yet achieved full democracy. For how long more can we do so? Well, all I can say is, let us hope that we will not be tested beyond the limit of our capacity. Thank you very much.
Just now, Mr. Justice Bukhari has mentioned about different cases. For example, one that about if a person has undergone gender reassignment surgery, whether he or she can marry or not. And this actually is very related to one of our students sharing later on in a few minutes. And also, Mr. Justice Bukhari has mentioned about there is no definition of democracy, and he also gave us a lot of background information on the legislative process, for example, the separation of power, and focusing on how it is done in reality. And also he told us about that the heart and soul of human rights is actually to be able to respect self and others, to live with dignity as a human, and also socio-economic rights that we enjoy every in our daily lives, just like how we are going to school every day and receiving education. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Justice Bukhari, for sharing just now. And now it's time for the interactive session between Mr. Justice Bukhari and our fellow student leaders. Today we have a special part of this interactive session since we're so lucky to have Mr. Justice Bukhari here with us. We will be choosing the most influential leader. On Facebook, we organized an activity where 60 participants shared their view on the question, if I can elect a new law or change an existing law to protect human rights, it will be. And their sharing can be expressed in videos, in terms of videos or photos. And out of the 60 participants, we have chosen 10 of them. And out of the 10, we will now listen to the sharing by 3 of the students with the most likes, with over 100 likes on Facebook. And with this precious opportunity of sharing their thoughts with you, Mr. Justice Bukhari, we hope that you'll be able to give them some advice on their ideas respectively.
Hello, Mr. Bukhari and everyone. My name is Lee Kam-yan from Confucian Corporation College. Have you ever been stand at by someone, even when you have done nothing wrong and strange? I haven't, but I have seen someone who has. One time, I was at MTR together with a South Asian. A man next to him kept looking at him as if he was a monster. Suddenly, that man swore at him and then walked away to another car. Many people suffer discrimination just because they look different skin, different hair, and a different clothes. This is very difficult. Some people, they very hard to show others they are the same. Why cannot others try harder to understand? If I can change the law, I hope the government can tell school to educate children from an early ages. But difference exists, so that we can reduce racial discrimination in the society. Confucius said, do not impose on others what yourself you do not desire. So all of us are global village. We are the great big family, so there could be no difference for us. So please don't discriminate others just because they look different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee Kam-yan. I think she's quite nervous, as I was just now, because she's, after all, the first candidate among the 3. And I actually think about racial discrimination is actually quite a severe problem in Hong Kong today, because I also did on this topic for my IES project. And I also agree to what you say. I did a lot of research and all those stuff, and I really agree that actually this problem really needs to be solved right now, and I really agree to that. You have this law. It's pretty inspiring. Let's invite our second candidate, Winnie Zhang.
Oh, hello everyone. And I'm Winnie Chong from CNMA Xinqi Secondary School. Okay, at the beginning of my sharing, I would like to ask you a very common and interesting question. How many of you here are using Facebook? If you are one of them, will you please raise up your hands now? How about Mr. Justice Bukhari?
I'm too old-fashioned for that. You want to look at my mobile phone? It's the type that but it's very good, because if you drop it in the street, people will pick it up and give it back to you.
Never mind, maybe later on you can activate your account.
Well, of course.
Yeah. Okay, while you are chatting happily at Facebook with your friends, do you know that Facebook, there is a potential risk that Facebook may mistreat your data, like your status, your comments, your friends list, etc. Okay, you may ask, why will I say so? It's because I got this idea from an example. In 2010, a Facebook games app, I think, sold and exposed all the data of the clients to different advertising companies and online tracking companies. Then these companies can do whatever they want with the data, like advertising or just to do whatever they want. That means Facebook can also do so, although there is no previous examples to show that there is a mistreatment of data of Facebook. This shows the privacy problem of Facebook is really a kind of worth concerning. To play safe, I would like to sincerely propose to elect a human law, which is to prevent the social networking sites like Facebook to collect or save the user's data in order to protect our privacy. You may say, it's just a common sense for Facebook to save our data. But however, have you ever thought that the consequence when Facebook misuse our data? We will never know how Facebook will deal with our data, and it may cause a kind of infringement of privacy. Although there's some privacy terms in Facebook when we log in or when we activate our account, but we are forced to agree with these terms in order to activate or be a user. So I think this law is a kind of meaningless to us. So with all the ideas and reasons mentioned, I hope this law will finally exist one day in Hong Kong in order to protect the privacy of all the users, including you and me. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. Well, in my opinion, I think it is also quite ironic that Facebook as a social network, it should be allowing us to share our daily activities while allowing us to maintain our privacy. However, today Facebook has become a platform where privacy is breached. Let us also thank and appreciate Winnie for her attention on social and personal issues such as this. And lastly, we have our third candidate, Ryan Wong.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Brian Wong from Thousands Boys School. So before I start my story, I would like to ask a question. So if you walk on the street today, you encounter a person. He looks a bit like a boy and a bit like a girl. How would you classify him or her? So if you see such a person, what characteristic would you choose on to classify the person?
Well, I mean, I would try to avoid, if I was in that state of confusion, saying anything that would be offensive to this person. They must choose their own identity, and I would seek to respect it. If I was in any danger of perhaps attributing to them an identity which they themselves did not choose, then I would do everything to avoid that. And as soon as I knew what they chose, I would respect that 100%.
Yeah, so it is agreed that gender of a person should be respected with his or her own condition of gender. So recently, I watched a TV program called University in Taiwan. So it's 大学生了没? So anybody have watched that program? No? Okay, so...
Those guys spent too much time watching TV.
So it's actually an online TV show. So it's a program where people university students will be invited to the show with different hosts to share their feelings on different social conditions. So often there are some guests that are quite special. So they are male biologically, but they appear to be as female with dress and long hair, and more permanently that they also wear that in their daily life. So they are not wearing it for drama like I do, okay? So they are not wearing, if you have seen my photo on Facebook. So because the photo I post on Facebook is me wearing female costumes. Okay, anyway, so people actually do wear costumes because they believe that they are female, even though biologically they are born as male. So my proposal or my question raised is that people should not be people should be identified the gender of their own connection because they should be respected to who they are but not what they are born as. So no matter is according to your marriage audience so I suggest on Facebook that people should be allowed to choose their gender as to be registered according to their own connection but not biologically what they are or some parts that they possess. And also, but I hope to extend this to their own identity in the society of their gender regarding to their cognition, but not who they are born at. Because we should not hate or discriminate people with what they are born at, but to appreciate who they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. This is honestly one of the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I'm really, really touched because I've seen your I've seen your photo on Facebook, and actually, in my opinion, I really think it's quite difficult. If I have to pretend as a boy and put my photo on Facebook, I think it'll be really, very difficult for me. But I'm really amazed by how you're really willing to put up the courage and post a Facebook photo of yourself dressed as a girl with a wig. I think Brian really deserves another round of applause for his courage. So, Mr. Bukhari, do you have any thoughts, ideas, or any comments for their ideas?
Now, in relation to the question of racial discrimination, of course, we've all come across it. When I was a law student in England, in all matters of importance, I was treated with complete equality, but some landlords would not wish to rent you a room if you were not white. And because my English wasn't too bad, if I spoke to them on the telephone, I would tell them that I wasn't white. And some of them would say, well, what does that matter? And some of them would say, in a very polite way, they would rather not let it to you. When I was working as a porter in a department store during the summer holidays, the ladies who were operating the canteen were all black. And they would give much more food to anybody who wasn't white. And to a white person, they would give much less food. And I used to say to my friends, well, white, don't worry. When we get back to the table, I'll give you some. So these things happen. You know, a concrete example of the situation in Hong Kong is it's very ironic that there was a time when there were a lot of policemen from South Asia in Hong Kong, and they were in some way acting in the old colonial way as a buffer between the British and the local people. And they weren't really very much of the local population. Ironically, a lot of their children are now very much of the local population. Probably Cantonese is their first language. If you didn't see them and you just heard them speaking, until you turn around, you wouldn't know that they were not Chinese. And there are not that many people of this type in the police, and that's ironic. And I think that there will be people joining the police from this community, and then there will be truly Hong Kong people, admittedly of a different ethnicity, in the police in Hong Kong. Now, when it comes to the protection of privacy, sometimes the media does not give as much support to the protection of privacy as they do to other human rights, because they understandably fear that this will interfere with media freedom, and their fear is correct. But I think we could all do our best to make the media understand that it is perfectly possible to promote a proper right of privacy without interfering with media freedom. And then we will have the support of the media, without which nothing can be achieved in a free society. Thomas Jefferson, the great president of the United States, said if he had to live in a society either without newspapers or without government, he would choose newspapers to government. That's how important it is. So we have to develop a right to privacy which doesn't interfere with other rights like information and so on and so forth. As far as the absence of gender discrimination, it is an evolving topic. You have to carry the general public with you. You and I probably think a little bit further ahead than most people, and we won't achieve anything if we don't carry people with us. But that case that we had on the person who had undergone gender reassignment surgery, actually I found an extremely easy case to decide. And I was telling the research assistants in the court of final appeal, even before the case came on, I said, well, actually, when you think about it, what are you going to say? Are you going to say that the person has no right to marry? If you say the person has no right to marry, you deny their humanity. That is impossible in conformity with human rights. And the right to marry is a human right. If you say that this person must get married in the previous capacity before the reassignment, then you're making a nonsense of reassignment, which is in fact paid for by the government in a government hospital. So if you can't say they cannot marry, and it would be nonsense to say that they must marry in the pre-reassignment capacity, what is left? Very simple, the right to marry in the reassigned capacity. It was an extremely simple case. Actually, cases are not always simple. This one was.
Thank you very much, Mr. Justice Bakari. And now moving on to another part of this interactive session, where our student leaders shall be expressing their own opinions and ask Mr. Justice Bakari questions, followed by sharing or an answer from you, Mr. Justice Bakari. This will be a great chance for all of you student leaders to exchange ideas with Mr. Justice Bakari. And by the end of this interactive session, each student here will vote for their favorite opinion leader. They will give their student number before they express their ideas or questions. And if you'd like to, Mr. Justice Bakari, you can also choose your favorite opinion leader.
Oh yeah, I have a right to vote as well.
So may we now invite the first student leader to give their question.
Hello, Mr. Justice Bakari. My name is Kevin, and my student number is 85. Recently, the Secretary of Education has warned the local students attending the occupying central is illegal. But the pro-democracy reporter said the participants of the activity are just violating some injustice law. For example, like unlawful assembly should not be regarded as a real breaking of the law. Besides, the current development of the activity is all legal, like they are debating day or some conference about it, but they are not still occupying the central yet. What they're doing is legal. Do you think that the Secretary of Education is warning us or restricting us on our human rights towards participation of different political movements? Also, the government is trying to set many frames on the basic law, like the Basic Law of 45 about the universal suffrage, trying to restricting our open full development on this situation, situation. And then, like the many PRC government people or many Hong Kong government people are saying that the coming up chief is executive must be loving the China and loving Hong Kong, but it isn't stated in the law. So, do you think that is reasonable, and should Hong Kong citizens agree with what they did and still follow what they did, but not doing any reaction towards what they say? Thank you.
Now, dealing with the last thing, if you had true democracy in Hong Kong, nobody would be able to win an election if they stood up and said, I hated China and I hated Hong Kong. Your fear is that this formula is being used in some unacceptable way. And I can understand your fear. As far as Occupy Central itself is concerned, I have to be very circumspect in what I say for the reason that it is now in the realms of not only politics, but party politics. And of course, one may have cases arising out of what may or may not happen. And I'm still a judge before whom such cases theoretically could come. What I will say is something of an academic nature about civil disobedience. which has nothing to do specifically with Occupy Central, but to deal with the topic of civil disobedience in a way which may be helpful to you to have some further insight into how it's seen. Now, sometimes a person may deliberately breach the letter of a rule of common law or the letter of a statutory provision. And they do that in order to bring a prosecution upon themselves for the purposes of challenging the constitutionality of that law. So they're not saying, I'm now breaching a law. What they are saying is that I have identified something which people seem to think is law, but which I say is not law at all because it is unconstitutional, and I will do the things that will cause me to be prosecuted, and then I will defend myself by challenging the constitutionality of it. Now, that perhaps is not really civil disobedience. Sometimes at the other extreme, you have a situation where somebody says, I will breach this law because it's necessary to do so, in my view, in order to publicize and advance the cause in which I believe. But I don't actually object to this particular law. But breaching it is part of the activities which I will be engaging in order to make my point. So that too may not be civil disobedience in its pure form, because you're not breaching a law which you say is unjust and which ought to be repealed. You are breaching a law which you say is an acceptable law in itself, but you have to breach it, in your opinion, in order to make your point. What is pure civil disobedience is breaching a law to which you object. You say that this law is unjust. Maybe there's no constitution by which it can be challenged, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I will do it, if necessary, as a martyr, so that you will be discredited if you prosecute me. Now, civil disobedience perhaps was most famous in the hands of Mahatma Gandhi. And when he defied the law that imposed a monopoly on salt, he, of course, had a larger agenda, which was the whole of British rule in the subcontinent. But he did object specifically to the salt law to which he was breaching. And that was civil disobedience in its pure form. Having mentioned Gandhi's name, permit me to tell you one thing that he said, which I think is very relevant to our lives, and particularly when you come, as I know you will come, into positions of authority. He said that when you are contemplating action, turn your mind to the most disadvantaged person whom you have recently met, and ask yourself how your action will affect that person, and then take action. That was Gandhi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your detailed explanation, Mr. Justice Bokhari. Now let us invite the second student leader for his question.
Hello, Mr. Justice Bokhari. I'm John Yu, number 148. In this year, more and more mainland Hong Kong conflicts have aroused. Uncivic behaviors of mainlanders have been causing harassment to Hong Kong people. Recently, there's a growing number of anti-Chinese campaigns in Hong Kong. Mainland tourists are usually the object of ridicule and severely discriminated against. To protect the dignity of mainland tourists, I would suggest that legislation should be implemented to protect the mainlanders from discrimination. But at the same time, the problem is, here in Hong Kong, People can enjoy the freedom of speech, protest, and assembly. What I want to ask is it possible to have the legislation, and is it possible to strike a balance between the rights and the law of legislation? Thank you.
Now, of course, when you are concerned with freedom of speech, you will have to recognize that hate speech can be prohibited by law consistently with free speech. But you always want to deal with it as gently as possible, because if you don't, it might become counterproductive. As far as open hostility in the face of a mainland tourist, it would be the same as open hostility in the face of anybody else. It could create a number of offenses under the criminal law. Maybe it is not so much a matter of enacting more laws, but of enforcing the existing laws in a more effective way. You know, there is a tendency on the part of politicians very often to call for laws to deal with situations because laws can be passed quite cheaply. It doesn't cost any money. So if there is a terrible case of violence against a wife, it would be quite easy to say call for more punishment, heavier penalties. That actually is not the answer, because if a man is sufficiently violent to his wife, I could, under the existing laws, put him in prison for life. But nobody will be able to do anything if she doesn't complain. And whether or not she complains depends on whether she has an alternative. And whether or not she has an alternative depends on whether you provide shelters for battered wives. And that costs money, which governments don't like to spend. So it's easier to ask for increased penalties than to provide shelters. So one always has to be practical about the whole thing. I'm not talking about education. I think some of these people who are terribly biased against mainlanders are not going to be educated because they only see what they want to see. Now, quite honestly, whether a tourist is from the mainland or from any other part of the world, it is very often the case that all their good behavior or normal behavior will not be noticed, but as soon as something is done which is objectionable, it is noticed, which is very unfortunate. Now, over the years, I have given a number of decisions which I would have thought would be in favor of mainlanders, all the abode decisions, when I was part of the majority and in the cases in which I was in dissent. And I'm very sorry to see that they are treated badly in Hong Kong. It is most unfortunate. I'm not saying that none of them misbehave. That would be ridiculous to say that, because you might as well say that no Hong Kong person misbehaves. Of course they do. But you must not stereotype them. So yes, if the situation deteriorates, you might have to pass further laws. But at the moment, I think that you have to watch very carefully what you can do with the existing laws and enforce those firmly, but with sensitivity, so as not to exacerbate the situation. Unfortunately, there is a certain unhappiness in Hong Kong for various reasons, and people who are unhappy very often look for a scapegoat. It may be a South Asian man you want to swear at on the MTR, or it may be a mainlander, or maybe somebody from Mars, if you can find one. So it's a very unfortunate phenomenon of human life. We have to deal with it on many fronts, But I don't want to talk about education because, frankly, I think some of these people are not interested in being educated. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Bakari, and I'm Natalie Choi. My student number is 245. And in our world, different countries are using different law systems, like we are practicing basic law, but some of them are practicing common law, and their political systems are different. And it comes to a situation that a lot of human rights activists are raising the concern of freedom and democracy. But due to the present political system, they're arrested. So my question is, do you think upholding rule of law necessarily protects human rights? Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Bakari. My name is Louise, and my student number is 305. And so, under the rule of law, do you think somebody should be sent to jail as he or she has committed crime due to his or her intention in achieving a better society? Thank you.
Now, to answer both of those questions together, of course, upholding the rule of law will further human rights if you define the rule of law in any way remotely resembling the explanations which I've given you, where I said that one of the components of the rule of law is the protection of human rights. There has to be a quality of the law and not just a statement of the law bereft of quality. There are times when it may well be that some people will see a cause as sufficiently important as to justify a breach even of a law which in itself they do not object to. This is not the first time that the world has faced this kind of situation. It will not be the last. But you always have to make these assessments for yourself with sincerity. And you must never forget the strength of the cause in which you are acting. On the other hand, you do not want to forget that the laws are there to preserve a certain order. And if you can breach an otherwise unobjectionable law to further your cause, your just cause, you have to consider the possibility that some people might do exactly the same thing to further their unjust cause. So there is an objective quality in the law which can be very tiresome. Not tiresome only to young students in school, but tiresome to old judges as well. But we have to consider how much we ought to put up with this for the larger reason that I've given you. But ultimately, people will act in accordance with their conscience and their convictions. They will take upon themselves such consequences as they are willing to bear. And beyond that, I don't think you can lecture people. Thank you.
I'm students number 256. I have a question about the controversy about the patent for drugs and the pharmaceutical industry. And the human rights aspect, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. However, the patent has just discriminated between the rich and the poor, which allowed the monopoly of the industry and allowing holding the price high, and which result in the poor people cannot receive a proper treatment. and the hiddening of the treatment of infectious disease has killed 11 million people worldwide each year. Our question is how to balance between the importance of intellectual property and the human rights, and does the patent right have violated the human right? Thank you.
Now we'll have the second question.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Carey. I want to ask a question that is quite sensitive. Basic law marks that Hong Kong has its high degree of autonomy, but the PRC government seems to interfere the internal affairs of Hong Kong government all the time. So do you think Hong Kong still has the high degree of autonomy or just exists in name? Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Justin Gregory. My name is Jasmine Ko, and my student number is 241. Yeah. And I'm going to talk about busing right of protest versus abusive police power. As we know that Hong Kong is a city of protest, these protests have awakened the need to voice our opinion. The demonstrations become more extreme nowadays. Clashing with police and blocking of traffic are common during the protests. According to the public order audience, the police have the obligations to take measures to facilitate lawful demonstration to be held in a peaceful way and to preserve the public peace. However, the police are accused of abusing their power and suppressing public right of demonstration due to their inappropriate control measures during the protest. And my question is, do you think that how much power should be given to the law enforcement bodies during peaceful protests, or how could be better strike a balance between the individual freedom to assembly, including in the human rights, and also the general interest in maintaining and protecting the public order? Thank you.
The question of pharmaceuticals is very difficult. The pharmaceutical companies will say that investors will put their money in something other than research and development if they can't make money out of the fruits of their research and development. And I think that is probably true. On the other hand, there are things you can do short of wholly undoing the right to intellectual property, and some initiatives have been taken in Africa. I wish you had asked me this question, not now, but a few weeks afterwards, because I'm going off to Africa to participate in a law conference, and there I will have an opportunity to speak to them. Maybe I will know a bit more about it after I've spoken to them. But it is actually a very difficult problem. You know that people are driven by motive, profit motive. There's not the slightest doubt. And you could make a lot more money if you could come up with a product that would make people look a lot better or help them lose weight than you would if you actually came up with a product that cured some very serious diseases, especially if the product is something which would be paid for by very rich people. So it is actually a very difficult problem. The answer is that we must find this balance, and the balance probably has to be worked out sometimes in the context of a particular emergency, such as the medicine in relation to AIDS. It's not very satisfactory to have to deal with it on this sort of, when there's an emergency, I will deal with it, but that seems to be the reality of it. Now, as far as other questions are concerned, remind me of what the second one was. Can you repeat that again?
It was about autonomy.
Yes. No, that was the third one. What was the second one?
Oh, there's another one that is about public order vs.
Oh, yes,
rights
public
of
order.
protest.
Right. Now, public order, the reason why I forgot was that I have so much to think about. Now, the power of the police would be less than it is if the dissenting view, which I expressed in Leung Kwok Hong's case, prevailed. So certainly they do have more powers than I say is constitutional. But the powers were reduced by the majority's decision as well, and their view represents the law unless and until the court rethinks it. Now, I think when you are dealing with how the police exercise their powers, this is always a very sensitive area, not only in Hong Kong, but everywhere in the world. One probably wants to investigate the orders that the police had, and I don't mean just the specific orders, but the operational order which is drawn up in relation to large events, and look at that. Because when it comes to the actual things that happen on the ground, there are great difficulties in the way of the individual policeman. They have their orders to obey. They can't sort of listen to their orders on the one hand, hold a copy of the basic law at the same time on the other hand, and decide which order to obey and which order not to obey. It's very difficult. So we have to recognize the difficulty of the individual police officers. We have to recognize that when it comes to operational matters, the police are the experts. But if you suspect that there's some political bias in the general approach, then you can certainly debate that. And I think that the authorities ought to be prepared to debate this thing each time. So I think you have to recognize the difficulties on the part of the police, but I think people are also entitled to say, well, what was your general orders in relation to this matter? When it comes to autonomy, well, I think that there is a perception that mainland officials are now involving themselves in local affairs more than was anticipated. They will say that what they do is perfectly justified and necessary. Other people might take a different view. I think it is important that questions like this should be constantly raised and constantly debated in as calm a fashion as possible. But if they're debated in a heated fashion, that's still better than them not being debated at all. I reacted by public statement to certain things that were said, and people suspected that I was reacting to something that Miss Elsie Leung said. Now, Miss Elsie Leung is a good friend of mine, and I have said things in support of her in the past, and am prepared to say things in support of her in the future. But when she said we were wrong, I said that she was wrong in saying we were wrong. But I would say that at least she did it openly. She did not, having the ears of the mainland officials, whisper in their ears all sorts of ideas. She spoke about it openly, and people in Hong Kong could answer it openly. And I think that's very creditable. That is to be praised. And really, the interference that you say you can see is not really all that dangerous, because you can see it and you can deal with it. If there was interference behind the scenes, which we don't know about, then that would be more unfortunate. But the mere fact that such interference, if you wish to call it, is happening in public shows there's a certain openness about it, and there's still something healthy about that. So let us continue to debate these things calmly if possible, but even if we get into a shouting match, let's still debate it anyway and not just keep quiet. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Pukari. People of different generations of different places have their role to play with, and like you, the judge of the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong, you judge this case as how you think owing to your profession and value. And in an open occasion, you've once mentioned that Hong Kong's rule of law is under threat. So what do you think the role should we, young people in Hong Kong, should play in society to tackle barriers that come across to full democracy and the rule of law in Hong Kong? And also, do you think the unexpected population of young people in Hong Kong participating in Hong Kong's political affairs is beneficial to Hong Kong? Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Bukhari. I'm Janet Wong from St. Paul's Convent School, and my student number is 297. Recently, there is a growing number of journalists who face threats in their work of expressing sensitive views on controversial social issues. For instance, the senior editor in Mingpao, Lau Chuntao, was attacked and severely injured. Because of this, some people think that the freedom of press in Hong Kong is being threatened. And you've said before in a television program called Newsline that the media is a greater bulwark of the rule of law than even the judiciary itself. So do you think that the freedom of press is really threatened, or did these cases just happen coincidentally? If your answer to this is the former, do you actually believe that the rule of law in Hong Kong is also threatened because of the diminishing of liberty of press? Thank you.
Now, dealing with the last question first, the concerns over press freedom can spring from many sources. And perhaps the greatest cause for concern is the worries which the journalists' associations themselves express. If they say they are worried, I don't think we should tell them that they shouldn't be worried. But as far as specific cases are concerned, since there have been some arrests, I don't wish to say anything because people may face charges. Those charges may be before a jury, which could be influenced by things that were said. But of course, any attack upon any person is a serious matter, and if there's reason to suspect that it may be related to something like press freedom, then anxiety will grow. But anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing, because complacency is more dangerous. One of the earlier questions was the
About
threat to the rule of law.
Yes.
And I said that there were storm clouds on the horizon. And some people say to me that, in fact, that's an understatement and the storm has actually arrived and so on and so forth. They're entitled to their view. I'm entitled to mine, and people are entitled to theirs. I said that there were storm clouds on the horizon. I said that the storm which it threatened would, if it broke, be one of unprecedented ferocity. And then I said that the court will stand up in that storm if it breaks. And I said that the court would stand up with the support of the people, which is very much the sort of thing that I was being asked about in the first and second question. You do have a role to play. And one of your roles is to ask what you can do. You can't just sit at home wondering and worrying about it until you decide that there's something very positive that you can do. You want to share your anxieties, debate these things, and interact with each other. You know, we have come here together today to discuss these matters. And when we go away, every one of us will have been influenced by every other one of us, including the ones who have not spoken, because they have shown support and interest by their mere presence. And as you grow up, you find more and more that what you are is the sum total of all the people with whom you've interacted. Somebody told me earlier that they had participated in a moot. Well, if you participate in a moot or you participate in debate, you have a debt of gratitude to your opponents, just as they have a debt of gratitude to you, because they have taught you something just as you have taught them something. They have influenced you just as you have influenced them in some way which you may not have wholly understood at the time, which may in some future moment and the moment of great crisis stand you in great stead. So if I was able to write out a list and say, yes, these are the problems in Hong Kong, and yes, this is what you young people can do to solve it, I would write those two lists. But I can't write that list because those two lists cannot be written. Those two lists are somewhere there in amorphous form. And we cope with these problems and we deal with them by coming together, by expressing our opinions and our doubts, our uncertainties. We raise questions, we ask questions, we provide answers, and sometimes the questions give us pause for thought so that the answer we give now may even be better when we've thought about it further. And that is always part of the process. So you mustn't say to yourselves, well, I don't know exactly what I can do, the problem is very difficult, so I will do nothing. That's not the way. The way is to come together like this. And, you know, you are the future after all, and every old person has their own children and grandchildren, and they won't stand in the way of what the young people really think. They may sometimes, in a rather avuncular way, say, you young people should be more patient, you should be this, you should be that. But ultimately, I don't think that the older generation is interested in standing wholly against what young people feel, because you are the future, and you can't be expected to take your part in the future if somebody tells you to shut up until you grow up, because you will never grow up if you do that, and you'll never grow up if you bury your head in the sand. So you have to look at all of these problems, and if you go away from this without any solutions, but with just a heightened awareness of the problems that you have to cope with, that in itself will be an advantage. So, yes, young people must deal with it. You will build a future in which the very young people now of your age will be my grandchildren. So I'm looking to what you can do for their sakes. So I do want you to show an interest in all of these things, and it is a great pleasure for me to be here. Now, I suspect that at some stage in the evening, somebody, maybe you, is going to be so misguided as to thank me for coming here tonight. In fact, of course, the thanks should move from me to you. I know that somebody has their duty to do it. They will thank me no matter what I say. But I want to preempt that by saying whatever you say, double back from me to you. Thank you very much.
Now let's have one last question. Is it all right?
Well, you know.
They love you a lot.
I tell you what, whoever speaks first, I'll answer their question. It's very difficult. Who wants to ask it the most? Raise their hand the highest. All right, the boy that's... See, she chose you after all. If you wait long enough, somebody else will do your job.
Good evening, Mr. Justice Bucaro. I want to ask that what you evaluate the behavior of the government to ask for the MPC Standing Committee's interpretations of the Basic Law and the consequence about asking the MPC Standing Committee for the interpretations of the Basic Law. Thank you.
I think that the way the basic law is drawn, the best thing for the rule of law is that the courts will be trusted to seek an interpretation from the standing committee when the matter is really an excluded matter. And if the courts, after mature consideration, decide not to refer it, the best thing for the rule of law is for that decision to be respected. You can't have a perfect world, but I think that would be the best. Oh, by the way, I now remember I forgot to answer a question. Somebody asked me about the filibuster. Well, you know, filibusters are not something confined to Hong Kong. They happen everywhere, and legislatures everywhere have a procedure for bringing them ultimately to an end. But that is a power to be exercised with sensitivity, knowing that the people who are engaged in the filibuster are not doing it just for the fun of it, but because they feel that they have a cause which justifies even that perhaps extreme measure. So there has to be a balance, and you have to show patience. Ultimately, you have to do something, but I think that very often you have to show more patience than most people are prepared to show. It's better in the long run that way. Thank you.
Let's all make sure that since we are the future of our society, let's all make sure that we will not let down Mr. Justice Bakari's expectations for us and also the expectations of the society to us. And again, thank you for a detailed explanation and absolute patience for our 11 questions. Congratulations, we have a total of 11 questions, which is 4 more than our last lesson. Give a round of applause to yourself. And as a roundup, would you like to give some advice, some word of wisdom to our student leaders?
Well, I'd love to, if I could think of something to say, but I think you have got the point. Maybe what I should say to you is that when you are together in a group like this, all supporting each other, you probably don't need the inspiring words which I or any one of you could speak. What you need to do is to remember these things said by your fellow students, keep them in mind, and bring them to the forefront of your mind at the moment of crisis. Here we're all speaking the same language, we're probably all of the same sort of thought. But there will be times when you will be one in a crowd, and you will need all your judgment and all your courage and all your determination. That is the time to draw upon the strength which you have gathered from each other this evening and on occasions like this evening. Thank you. Ah, you're back.